What's up everyone, it's Dakota and welcome back to another Magic the Gathering video. And today we're talking all things Izzet Prowess today. We did kind of this beginner's guide a few months ago, I think sometime after, we played in our first RCQ and won to qualify for Regional Championship Houston. That's going to be taking place in about a month here, so really excited for that, and this is the deck that I ended up playing and actually performing very well. Since then, we've had a couple of 5-0s on Magic Online, so 4-1s that were very, very close to being 5-0s. We played in the Modern Showcase Challenge, went 5-4, unfortunately, but could have been a 6-3 with a little bit tighter play here. We're really only losing to Boros Energy, which I think theoretically is like one of the worst matchups for this deck. And which that sounds bad because Boros Energy probably to a lot of people is still one of the most popular and maybe to some like the best deck in the format. But it really isn't like I think that lopsided in all things, in all reality. We have a challenge top 8 with this deck, and of course there was another RCQ that we played at the Eric Johnson Memorial, which, shout out to all of them. I mean, like, especially Brian Beard, they're just great. It's a great event. I'm looking forward to going to it this next year when it goes on, and hopefully going for longer than a day and just being able to enjoy it because it was a really awesome experience. I super enjoyed it, so shout out to them. But went and played in their Modern RCQ, ended up making the top 4 and just splitting and everything. So this deck has served me very well, and when I think this deck is starting to look bad in the metagame or potentially just kind of be a bad choice, it just continues to kind of, keep going and continue to find success, not only top 8ing some of these bigger online like challenges, but end up actually winning those challenges. And I guess it really shouldn't be that surprising when you kind of look at it in just a broad lens here. It is an aggro deck that can win the game on, as early as turn 2. Realistically can do it on like turn 3 or turn 4, but also has a very respectable mid-range plan for a deck that is very much slanted towards being this kind of heavy aggro deck that is going to try and win the game very early on. So it's a deck that has continued to impress me. It's probably the best deck that I've had the opportunity to play in paper outside of like Hogak during the Hogak summer shenanigans. So today we're going to be doing a deep dive into the Izzet Prowess deck. We're going to be kind of rehashing some of the stuff we talked about in the previous video, and of course bringing in some new information that we've kind of learned along the way from like the probably 50 to 100 matches total, probably even over 100 at this point, of playing Izzet Prowess, and just giving you some tips that I found very helpful when piloting a deck, sideboard tips and kind of ideas, and some of the deck building, like the reasons for deck building, why you're playing certain copies of certain cards, because really the main deck is pretty straightforward. There are some main deck decisions that you have to make when building your deck, but compared to something like an Esper midrange, those numbers are a little bit cleaner than in this deck than something like that. But before we get into the video and we talk about the Izzet Prowess deck today, if you're already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me where we talk mainly about the Modern and Pioneer format, or Modern and Standard format, as well as some other longer form videos for your viewing pleasure. So if that's something that interests you, please consider subscribing and ring that notification bell so those videos get posted. It's a very easy way to support me and my content. And if you want even more content from me, you can go ahead and check out the description down below where you can go and subscribe to the Casual Spikes Podcast YouTube channel, follow me, or join the Discord server and follow me over on twitch.tv/Cori-Steel 23. Lastly, there's a code in the description down below for Manatraders. If you want to try out Izzet Prowess or any other decks that you see on my channel, consider signing up for Manatraders. Manatraders is a subscription service that you can subscribe to and be able to rent cards on Magic the Gathering Online so that you can play in various different competitive leagues, challenges, and potentially even qualify for the Pro Tour or Regional Championship through the online portion of competitive play. Manatraders makes it easy. You don't have to end up buying your own cards. Then if you want to play a different deck, try to sell them to get your money back to then buy cards for another deck. Manatraders makes it super easy to just rent and play whatever decks you want, whenever you want. And near instant trading makes it, literally like you have the deck in your hands in less than like 10 to 20 seconds. It's absolutely insane. And if you use my code in the description down below, you get 5% off your monthly subscription. I've been using them for over 5 years, and there's a lot of really cool rewards. Your rental limits can go up, and your prices and stuff monthly get cheaper the longer you're subscribed. So definitely go ahead and check them out. Using my code in the description down below, you get 5% off your monthly subscription. I want to thank Manatraders for being a sponsor of the channel. Now let's go ahead and talk about Izzet Prowess. So Izzet Prowess, as we talked about, is a deck that kind of toes the line between this a heavy aggro deck that is going to win the game very early on, and it's especially punishing from your opponents if they, miss a land drop, and especially if they're not like a Solitude deck. You can really kind of punish the combo players for minimally or not at all interacting with you, while also punishing the decks that end up stumbling, which is something that I really like across all formats here, especially in the year 2025, is just playing a deck that if your opponent is going to make a mistake, you're able to capitalize on it essentially immediately, and just kind of, it's alarm there, and just basically, put yourself so far ahead that a lot of bad things could happen on your side, maybe unlucky, and you're still going to kind of be able to hold the line and be able to cross the finish line before your opponent does. So obviously, being an aggro deck, there, in the fact that we are also this kind of like makeshift mid-range deck, there are a few things that we have to look at. So we'll kind of look at what I would consider to be the more aggro creatures of the format, or of the deck here. We have Manatraders Swiftspear, super simple, 1 mana, 1/2 haste prowess creature. This is essentially like, if you put the deck like in a nutshell, this is kind of what you want to see, especially from like the aggro draws here. This deck is all about just playing spells, getting value from your spells, and your creatures are going to end up kind of benefiting on top of you just playing spells. Where we would see maybe decks like this like 10-15 years ago, you'd be playing like auras, you'd be playing pump spells on like aggressively costed creatures, and then when your opponent like Doomblades your creature, well, then you're kind of set back, because not only are you losing the creature, but you're losing the other auras and of course the pump spells that you are attaching to these creatures. Now, while this deck does play pump spells, and there is a little combo in this deck that kind of goes with like one of the pump spells in this deck, it's not the main thing that we're doing here. We have a bunch of other spells that are just very good on rate. They're cheap spells that we're going to be able to cast multiple spells on a turn to really use the prowess on Manatraders Swiftspear, and like the prowess on the Cori-Steel Cutter tokens, and of course Slickshot Show Off, which is the other creature that is very aggressive here. And Slickshot Show Off being probably, of the three creatures, probably the best creature in terms of the hyper aggressive like aggro plan that we're trying to implement here, being a 2 mana 1/2 flying haste, that whenever you cast a non-creature spell, this creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. That's totally fine. There's plenty of ways that we can follow this up where we're going to be able to, again, continue to be aggressive and make it a huge power thing on turn 2, but really it's this plot mechanic that puts Slickshot over the edge, where you can essentially pay its mana cost, 1 and a red, and you exile it from your hand, and then you can cast it as a sorcery on a later turn without paying its mana cost, and you can only plot as a sorcery. So while it does take up your turn to plot a Slickshot Show Off, there's a lot of these turn 3 kills that happen because you plot a Slickshot on 2, then your opponent goes to like forward their board, and then you play Slickshot Show Off, you're able to get Delirium, and you cast like a 1 or 2 mana spell into like Mutagenic Growth into your double strike spell and just win the game. Like, that's kind of like the simple lines that you're looking for when you're trying to close out the game very, very early on. And Slickshot Show Off is able to make that happen, just because getting +2 instead of +1 on power is absolutely massive. And especially when, of course, Mutagenic Growth being free, Violent Urge being a 1 mana spell, and the fact that you do it at instant speed means that you're not committed to doing this all sorcery speed and furthering the potential of getting blown out. Plus, even if you're not doing the combo and you're just, say, playing like Lightning Bolts and Lava Darts to clear the way, or just to kind of, slow your opponent's development while, of course, forwarding your own, you're able to kind of make that investment, because now Lightning Bolt isn't just deal 3 damage to any target. It's deal 3 damage to any target, give +X+Y to your board, basically. And that's where you're really going to get got by these prowess strategies, is the fact that they don't have to commit spells directly to their creatures if they don't have to. And that's kind of the a problem, not necessarily the problem of like of specifically older prowess decks, but of like these super aggressive aggro decks, is that they needed to play these pump spells, give their creature double strike, do their thing, and they had to do it at sorcery speed. This deck doesn't have to commit to its creatures in that way, and it doesn't have to double strike unless it absolutely needs to, or it's very free and clear to do so. So between Slickshot Show Off and Manatraders Swiftspear, these creatures are plenty good enough. There's even draws that I've had where I've played like 2 or 3 Swiftspears, and it's dealt like 16 damage, total across them by like turn 3. And that's not taking into account any damage that your opponent has taken from like their own fetch lands and their own mana base, or playing their own spells, or any like burn spells or anything like that. Like, you can get your opponent super low. This deck is very good at, closing out games that are close, where you can just kill your opponent from 20 and put them to 0, or you can even put them to like 2 or 3, and a lightning bolt or like a lava dart and then a flashback lava dart is going to kill them, which of course is plenty good enough. There's been so many games where my opponent's able to only stop enough damage to go to a very low life total, only to lose then to a burn spell later. Feel pretty tilting, but that's just what this deck is able to accomplish. So we keep referencing this kind of like mid-range strategy that this deck has, and it kind of is represented in their threats, but their threats also double as like aggressive creatures. Dragon Rage Channeler, while in some cases I'd say is like your best turn 1 play over Manatraders Swiftspear. Swiftspears are really good at getting in when your opponent isn't really committing to the board in a way that is, like playing creatures or like playing removal spells, but you're pretty happy if a Manatraders Swiftspear ends up like eating a removal spell, because it's going to beat like a lot of the creatures in the modern format in combat. Dragon Rage Channeler is a card that can be pretty aggressive. With Delirium, it gets +2/+2, has flying and attacks each combat if able, so it's actually able to fly over, a very gummed up battlefield to be able to get in damage and keep chipping away at your opponent's life total, which is kind of where we get this kind of mid-rangey type feeling. But you can also very easily get Delirium on turn 2, so it's not even out of the realm of possibility where the draws that you would have like double Swiftspear into playing some spells, like playing double Dragon Rage Channeler and getting Delirium and just being able to attack for 3 and then attack for 6 in the air every single turn is an incredibly fast clock, and also wears kind of our combo kill very nicely as well. But while we also cast non-creature spells, while it's not going to be growing itself, like Manatraders Swiftspear or Slickshot show off, or the tokens from Cori-Steel Cutter, we are able to surveil, which is going to help smooth out our draws. Ideally, there are going to be times where you surveil 2, 3, 4 times, you're putting them all in the graveyard and still don't draw a card you want, but you're still looking at 4 to 5 cards on a draw step to be able to find, something like maybe Expressive Iteration or Preordain or whatever, to try to get some a little bit of velocity going and continue to kind of churn through your deck and find more threats, so then you can pair some threats with these non-creature spells that you're casting to, again, make it a lot harder for your opponent to come back and win the game, and really kind of widen that gap and giving yourself the best opportunity to win games. So yeah, like Dragon Rage Channeler is probably one of your best creatures that kind of toes the line between being a card that can be extremely aggressive and can start attacking for 3 damage on turn 2, or it can be a creature that it can kind of settle in, demands a removal spell, because over the course of a long game where Dragon Rage Channeler sits on the battlefield for even 2, 3, 4, 5 turns, that's going to be so much kind of like cards that you're looking at, and this kind of card selection type thing that you have going on, where you might not be drawing those cards, but you're going to be setting up, your own draw steps. You're going to be setting up your own cantrips and being able to maximize kind of like the leverage you get on Expressive Iteration, specifically, where you're going to be able to make sure that you essentially get a card in your hand that you really want, but then also are exiling a card that you're going to be able to play, whether it's going to be a land, a free spell, or any other spell that you can actually cast with the mana available. Now, the best part about this deck, and what really pushed Izzet Prowess, I think, over the top and really put it into the mainstream, is this card, Cori-Steel Cutter. Now, I don't know if you've heard of it before, so we'll read it all together. It's a 2-mana equipment. A quick creature gets +1/+1, has trample and haste. It has flurry. Whenever you cast your second spell each turn, you put a 1/1 white monk creature token with prowess into play, and then you may attach this equipment to it. So essentially, you're able to make kind of like a hasty 2/2 trampler at minimum, and a lot of the times you're going to see this on turn 2, where players are playing like Cori-Steel Cutter, and they're following it up with like Mishra's Bauble. You also have Mutagenic Growth, but kind of like as we'd been talking about, Mutagenic Growth is a tough one to kind of rely on as your free spell to trigger Cori-Steel Cutter, because you want to target a creature with it. Chances are, if you have to target your opponent's creature instead of your own creature, you're not going to be able to attack with a token, which means that you're kind of stopping your own offense and really kind of throwing away a combo piece to kind of get a token, when really it's not worth it. But nonetheless, like, Cori-Steel Cutter is, a way that, again, you can be aggressive if you're just kind of casting, multiple cantrips, or just even like playing creatures or whatever, because it doesn't care about non-creature spells specifically. It just, the monks care about it. But, Cori-Steel Cutter doesn't discriminate if it's, you casted another Cori-Steel Cutter, or if you cast itself that turn, because you're able to play it and then play a second spell and trigger the Cori-Steel Cutter. It doesn't care that if you're casting creatures, artifacts, whatever. It just cares that you've cast 2 spells in a turn. And a lot of the times too, it's not even advantageous for you, and it's not like this deck is necessarily designed to like say, okay, I'm going to make a token on my turn, and then I'm going to go to my opponent's turn, I'm going to make a token. Then I'm going to go to my turn, I'm going to make a token. Certainly you can do that, but this deck doesn't really want you to, since you want to kind of prioritize casting spells on your turn to make the most out of the kind of prowess effects that you have in play to be able to get in damage. You don't really want to waste, casting 2 spells on your turn to make an extra token, because if it means that you're only able to cast like 2 spells on your next turn, it's going to end up being less damage, where you could have cast 4 spells and even given the new creature that you made, +2/+2 on top of giving your other creatures an additional +2/+2 or +4/+0, however it works out. Especially when you kind of throw, mutagenic growth, violent urge stuff into the mix, because that's just so much potential damage that gets left on the board. So definitely, like, if you can, you're going to have enough spells. I mean, you could convince me that making a token every single turn and every single one of your opponent's turns is going to be helpful, and it's going to be a way that kind of wins you the game. If you're able to do it and it's not going to compromise like your next turn, where you're like, okay, I have a few tokens, I have a Swiftspear, and I have like a Dragon Rage Chandler or Shore Off, whatever it is, like now I'm going to cast a bunch of spells and basically demand that all of my creatures have answers, rather than I made an additional creature from what I would have ended up making, but at the cost of losing like 10 power on the board, which is something that can come up, and it is kind of like an opportunity cost that you have to take into account when kind of doing Cori-Steel Cutter things. These threats are absolutely amazing. I mean, again, like even like Slickshot Show Off, you can just plot this and you don't even have to play it on turn 3. If your opponent just never puts the shields down, like that's totally fine. Or you can use it kind of to your advantage, where you can kind of bait them with like a Cori-Steel Cutter, because they like Cori-Steel Cutter Resolve. Guess what? You have a free spell that you can cast that you're going to be able to generate a token immediately off of Cori-Steel Cutter. And there's not very many cards that exist in the modern format that is going to be able to deal with a Slickshot and Cori-Steel Cutter kind of all in the same breath. And even if they are, they're in decks that are a little bit more fringe, I would say, than what players are opting to play with at this current time. So this is our threat package. This is exactly what we're looking for in terms of trying to close out the game. Now, the important thing for these prowess decks, of course, is the non-creature spells. I mean, it's kind of the reason why Slickshot and Cori-Steel and Manatraders Swiftspear and Dragon Rage Chandler end up getting to be so powerful. So one of your key like non-creature spells is Mishra's Bauble. It sets up so much and represents so much with the caveat, I guess, that the things that it represents are forever changing. At its floor, being a 0-mana artifact that is going to allow you to get some information, there's plenty of bauble tricks, being able to look at your own card and deciding whether you want to play a fetch land because you really want that card, or even cracking the bauble now, waiting later, being able to go to get a surveil land, and then deciding if you want to kind of, whatever the case may be. There are plenty of tricks out there with Mishra's Bauble. This also potentially represents, +1/+1 or more to like your creatures. It also means that Cori-Steel Cutter is making a token on turn 2 rather than having to wait until turn 3. This is also putting an artifact in your graveyard for Delirium. It's drawing you an extra card on turns where, okay, I need to have a turn where I draw maybe 2 very specific cards, or I need to draw like 2 non-creature spells. Well, this is going to be something that allows you to play it for free. You're going to be able to commit more mana to like other spells like Lightning Bolt, Lava Dart, Preordain, or potentially even Expressive Iterations. Another card that you really enjoy hitting off of Expressive Iteration, because it is a card that you can just put into exile and you're not worried about exiling it forever, unless you somehow just exile it and completely forget that it's out there. That you have like 2-second memory and you just completely forget that you put Mishra's Bauble exiled off of Expressive Iteration. This card just does so much for this deck. And one of the tips I'll kind of give now is that I actually really like holding Mishra's Bauble. While it can be very tempting if you play like Dragon Rage Chandler or Manatraders Swiftspear on turn 1 to want to immediately play Bauble, there's times where it makes sense, but I think a lot of the time you're okay with waiting. Even if you play like Dragon Rage Chandler on turn 1, your opponent has a removal spell for Dragon Rage Chandler, that's fine. I would rather leave myself open to, potentially triggering Cori-Steel Cutters, or, if the matchup requires it, playing a Slickshot Show Off or Manatraders Swiftspear, and then just being able to get the additional pump from Mishra's Bauble level, just getting just a little bit more value because the floor on the card's already pretty high. Like, this card is already better than a lot of the other decks in the Modern format. Like, this is a card that, you know, gets even better when you have more things in play that can take advantage of the fact that it is a free non-creature spell that, while we don't get to abuse the drawing of an extra card, but is a card that is going to replace itself later, because we don't necessarily, I mean, if it replaces itself right away, that would be awesome, but, you know, we don't have that luxury in 2025, but this is a card that, you know, you are able to essentially get a card back, while again also providing additional pump to your team and all the other benefits that we kind of listed here. Some of these cantrips, because they kind of vary on like how powerful they end up being. Preordain is always going to be like one of your better cantrips to play on turn 1. This is a way that you can, you know, get Delirium in the graveyard and really set up like a turn 3 kill with Slickshot Show Off. Scry 2, then draw a card. Super simple, all for 1 mana. It's going to put a sorcery in your graveyard. You know, we have a bunch of these like cheap/free instant spells over here. We have, you know, free artifacts so we can put into the graveyard. We have a bunch of fetch lands. You know, we're able to get Delirium. Sorcery is just kind of the one that we're, you know, scratching our heads on like how we're going to get. Because it's either that or we have to figure out a way to put a creature in the graveyard, especially in the games where our opponent isn't necessarily removing our threats, or better yet, not using destroy spells to get rid of our creatures, but rather using exile effects. And Preordain is one of those cards where we're going to be able to look at potentially up to 3 cards, you know, or more, depending on if Dragon Rage Channeler is on the board. You know, it means we're not playing Preordain in turn 2, but either way, this is a card that does set up a lot here and is just really good whether you're playing, personally for me, whether you're playing in matchups that are intended to be a little bit grindier or even in some of the combo matchups, because again, it just kind of sets up your combo kill very early on. Expressive Iteration is probably the worst card in the deck, which is crazy to think because a few years ago, this was probably considered the best card in Modern. So for a red and a blue, you can look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 in your hand, 1 on the bottom of your library, and 1 at exile, and you play the exile card this turn. That's why it is super important that we have all the, you know, as I say all these free spells, but, you know, these free spells and the fact that you're also like looking to play Expressive Iteration like on turn 3 in a lot of cases, so you open up the possibility of just playing a land off of an Expressive Iteration, or if you already have the 3rd land, then you can play a 1 mana spell off of it, which a lot of our deck is 1 mana spells, where you just kind of lose out on Cori-Steel, Slickshot, and other Expressive Iterations, which you can probably just end up putting those in your hand, and one of the 2 other cards you're able to play, whether it's a land or a cheap spell. This just ends up not being very good in like combo matchups. Like, yeah, like the fact that you get to draw 2 cards for 2 mana a lot of the time is going to be good in almost any matchup that you play. Just when it's kind of a race to, you know, am I going to get my opponent's life total to 0 from 20, or are they going to do it to me, or are they going to find some way where they end up winning the game, bail me out, whatever. And Expressive Iteration is just kind of awkward, I think, in those matchups, because there's times where I'm like, I really wish this was like literally any other card, when we just don't have the time to kind of set it up and get the most value out of it. That said, I think it is a necessary evil. I think that there are plenty of grindier games where you just want Expressive Iteration to, you know, when you kind of do your thing and you're down to like a few cards and it's like, well, fuck, I really need kind of a spark. Expressive Iteration is either going to eat a counterspell or it's going to resolve, and you're going to get to kind of draw 2 cards and start to slowly make your way back into the game. Like, Expressive Iteration into putting an iteration in your hand and playing a free spell is going to be a massive game for you in trying to claw back in those matchups where, you know, maybe your opponent has essentially decimated most of your board. Maybe you just have like a Cori-Steel Cutter in play. You know, that's going to be kind of the thing that you're looking at. This is even like, again, in some of those grindy matchups where if you just play Cori-Steel on turn 2 and don't have like a free spell to follow it up with, Expressive Iteration is a great way of following up your turn 3 by giving you a very high likelihood of being able to trigger Cori-Steel Cutter, again, whether finding, you know, land, cheap spell, or whatever the case may be, to end up triggering the flurry on Cori-Steel Cutter. The rest of the spells here, we have 4 Lava Dart. Lava Dart is essentially a spell that you can cast twice. You can pay 1 red mana, deal 1 damage to any target. It does have some applications. There are some really small creatures in the Modern format that you are totally fine with dealing a damage to, because it's going to get them off the board. But it also flashbacks for sacrificing a mountain. You play plenty of mountains in this deck. Actually, I really don't like how this mana base is set up, because there's 2 mountains. I prefer 3, and you can probably end up cutting a Fiery Islet here, even though I also am really a big fan of Islet. I'm like, the mana base is something that I would want to kind of mess with a little bit more, like on the fringes here, where most of like the other stuff is pretty safe here. But you want mountains to sacrifice to Lava Dart. This is a card that represents a ton of damage. Again, kind of like Mishra's Bauble, But where Mishra's Bauble, draws you a card and is free, so it has a lot of other things that kind of make it better on like turn 2 or turn 3. Lava Dart is a card that you're fine with milling off Dragon Rage Channeler. It's a card that you're fine with having in your hand, because again, when you set up those turns, in the fact that it is in of itself is a card that is going to trigger Cori-Steel Cutter right away, unless your opponent is able to like force a negation it, which I feel like you probably win if your opponent force negations a Lava Dart. Like, even if they pay mana to force a negation a Lava Dart, I feel like in like the overwhelming majority of scenarios, you end up coming very far ahead if your opponent does that. So take that for what you will. But again, this is a card that's going to trigger all of our prowess type effects. It's going to trigger our Cori-Steel Cutter. Amazing, and does it all for essentially 1 mana and sacrificing a land, which this deck doesn't need that many lands to end up operating. Lightning Bolt, 1 mana, deal 3 damage to any target. Is a more than suitable removal spell for what we need it for, especially in the main board games, and also gives us a degree of reach. I mean, same thing with Lava Dart, but, just getting to deal 3 damage with 1 spell just means that the floor on this card is a little bit higher than Lava Dart, where like you're top decking, you're not necessarily sad to see a Lightning Bolt unless your opponent has absolutely decimated your board before you're able to really get in any amount of damage from those creatures, where Lightning Bolt a lot of the time is just good enough to finish off games. Lastly, we'll talk about here before we get into the mana base here. Mutagenic Growth, Violent Urge is our combo that we kind of talked about. Mutagenic Growth being a free spell gives your creature +2/+2 until end of turn. Violent Urge, if you have Delirium, is going to give your creature double strike, and it actually gives it +1/+0 as well. So with these, the thing that we were kind of talking about, like Slickshot, even if you just go Mutagenic Growth, Violent Urge, Mutagenic Growth gets up to 3 power, the Slickshot trigger gets it up to 5 power, the Violent Urge cast gets it up to 7 power, and then Violent Urge gives it +1 to give it to 8, which means that we're dealing 16 damage with a Slickshot show off just between Slickshot and these 2 cards here. And you throw in, Bauble, Preordain, Lightning Bolt, Lava Dart, or whatever, that number goes up even higher. You end up dealing so much more damage to your opponent, roughly 4 extra damage per non-creature spell that you're able to cast and get a trigger off a Slickshot show off. So this is kind of thing we're looking at, even when you're doing like Dragon Rage Channeler stuff, and you can get it up to 6 power, a 6 power double striker, and deal 12 to your opponent is still a significant amount that, again, opens the door for bolts and darts to kind of come in and finish off the game, or just like any one of these other, like Cori-Steel Cutter, making tokens and just consistently attacking your opponent and forcing them to find ways to block. The mana base, you have 1 Surveil Land, the Thundering Falls, and I swear to God, it'll end up in your hand every single time. I can't tell you how many games I've played where it's like, man, I really wish I still had Thundering Falls in my deck, and there's other times where I wish this Thundering Falls was literally anything else. I think I would prefer it to be an island a lot of the time, because sometimes you just want to untap land, and in this deck, when you are essentially keeping 1 and 2 landers, like the fact that your 2-lander has a land that is just going to come into play tapped, rather than having the option of going and fetching it tapped when you don't necessarily need your mana, feels pretty bad, but I think 1 Thundering Falls is necessary evil. We have 3 steam vents here, 2 mountain and 2 fiery islet are essentially around our lands that tap for mana. I would prefer probably the 3rd mountain over the 2nd islet, especially since I'd been a person that was playing, 1 less fetch land to play 3 mountain and 2 islet. I'd probably cut an islet for a mountain and then just kind of play the 10 fetch lands you see here in 4 Arid Mesa, 4 Scalding Tarn, and 2 Wooded Foothills. I think just the deck thinning, although marginal, is going to be very helpful in the long term. And also, again, just being able to fetch mountains, like reducing the amount of non-mountains in your deck or lands that don't get mountains, is probably a lot better for Lava Dart purposes, because like the times where you draw a 2nd islet and you're able to potentially crack it to draw a card or whatever is pretty marginal. Plus, like pinging yourself for damage as well does make some racing situations pretty awkward in the mirror matches, and just in those games where your opponent's like wanting to close out the game, like in Boros Energy and things like that. So the sideboard, which we'll touch on very, very quickly here. Consigned Memory seems to be kind of a necessary evil, just being able to counter key triggered abilities, or just counter colorless spells from the Eldrazi deck. The Eldrazi can be absolutely rough. Unholy Heat is another necessary evil. If you're playing against some of the fair mid-range decks, your combo plan isn't really all that great, and Unholy Heats are absolutely aces against those other decks. Surgical Extraction, Soul Guide, Lantern. Surgical more than Soul Guide, I think now is probably bordering on being more correct, but personally I like playing 2 Soul Guides over 2 Surgicals. I like playing 1 Surgical, 2 Soul Guides. You just get to essentially hit a key card in the graveyard when you play it, and then nuke the whole graveyard when you need to. Spell Snare is pretty good. There's a lot of really good 2-mana spells in the format. You know, I think of like Esper Goryo's, where you can just counter Goryo's Vengeance while still getting to forward your own game plan. A lot of the impactful 2-mana spells from the Boros Energy deck and etc. Spell Pierce and Into the Floodmaw are also just really good kind of like pieces to round out your sideboard. You don't get any super fancy tech. You can play some of the other, you know, Pyroclasm type effects, but I think the sideboard is pretty good in the current state of Modern to kind of really just make sure your deck is able to fight through some of the other mid-range kind of BS going on. But, you know, that's the main deck configuration. That's kind of the idea between some of these cards. Now let's go ahead and get into some of the tips and tricks that you need to know if you want to start playing this deck and being able to play it at a pretty high level to start. Before we get into some of the tips, there are kind of a few deck building things that you need to keep in mind when trying to configure your 60-card main deck and then even part of your 15-card sideboard here. One of the things that players have been tooling around with and really has seemed to be more so now than before. Before you would see decks playing 4 Mutagenic Growth, 2 Violent Urge. I think even now that's really the more popular there's really the more popular split between these two cards. But 3 and 3, I think, does kind of deserve a little bit of attention here. There's a lot of times where you only need 1 Mutagenic Growth anyway. A second one, a lot of the time, leads to overkill unless you're doing, like, you know, attacking with a creature that's equipped with, like, Cori-Steel Cutter, then, you know, getting it from 2 power up to 5, and then 6 up to 8, and then double striking it 9, 10, 20 trample, you know, on top of, like, all of your other creatures and stuff potentially getting in, which really your opponent's probably not blocking a trampler. They're probably blocking, like, one of the other creatures and stuff. But nonetheless, you know, Mutagenic Growth does, you know, a second Mutagenic Growth does mean in those scenarios that, like, with like, Manatraders, Swiftspear, and whatever, you're able to end up finding an easy path to dealing 20 damage to your opponent with one attack here. That said, the real, you know, thing that kind of pushes that combat over the edge is the fact that Violent Urge is an instant speed double striking spell, which means that you're a little less prone to getting blown out like you were with Assault Strobe. Where, you know, decks before, like in Izzet Prowess, would play Assault Strobe as like their way of you know, giving their creature double strike because it was going to give double strike no matter what. It's just sorcery speed. And this way, you are able to get Delirium whenever. Violent Urge being an instant speed double striker just means that, you know, you can attack for lethal, your opponent uses a removal spell, all of a sudden you don't have lethal anymore. Boom, Violent Urge gets you back into lethal range, and a lot of the times your opponent's just holding on to one piece of interaction, so that's kind of like the death knell for them, is that Violent Urge just, boom, gets in, deals the damage, and says goodnight to your opponent. A Mike Tyson-esque uppercut to the jaw, all without the ear biting. But yeah, there's an argument between 4 and 2. I think Mutagenic Growth, if you're just kind of playing this game where you're trying to get in a bunch of damage, and the fact that it is a free spell, you can trigger Cori-Steel Cutter some amount of time, even though unreliably on turn 2, like you can with Mishra's Bauble. It is a card that is going to be a free spell that's going to trigger all your prowess stuff and is going to help you get in for just that much more damage, and ends up acting as like kind of a burn spell in a way if you're able to put on a creature that is going to get in for damage. And then Violent Urge probably being the worst of them, because at least with Mutagenic Growth you could argue that Mutagenic Growth could get your creature out of range of like a Lightning Bolt or Galvanic Discharge or whatever, where Violent Urge is not necessarily going to do that sort of thing. Unless you're able to like play it in response to, like, you know, your thing's already a 3-power thing and it's getting bolted, or Galvanic Discharge and they don't have any energy, and then you play this to, you know, get a prowess trigger to bump it up even higher. But, you know, both of these cards end up being pretty bad in like the interactive matchups. Really, 4 and 2 again is like the more popular one, but I think there's some merit to the 3 and 3, especially if you're expecting more, or I guess if you're expecting less interaction / more decks that are going to want to kind of do their own thing or playing very limited interaction. You can get away with like playing 3 Violent Urge, and you're able to just more reliably end games versus, you know, hoping to draw like, you know, 1 and 1 when you're only playing like 2 copies of this card, and like you end up drawing multiple growths, which is fine because again, you're still getting a lot of damage, but nonetheless, like, you're really looking for that just double strike, boom, like this ends up just dealing like near infinite amounts of damage when you have it on like a 10-power show off. Secondly, and lastly, that we'll kind of talk about is Expressive Iteration. This card we've talked about in a lot of the in the mid-range matchups. It's one of your best cards, and has proven in its time in Modern that Expressive Iteration is one of the best cards when you're playing in these like super grindy strategies, even all the way here in 2025. And especially in this deck that really wants to play a bunch of spells and has the ability to really effectively use, play cards from exile with this Expressive Iteration. I've seen people cut one copy of Expressive Iteration and play something like Unholy Heat in the main board, or even, like, very rarely at times, like, play 3 Violent Urge for Mutagenic Growth. I think I'm too scared personally to not have 4 Iteration in my deck. There's times when your opponent's comboing where you're just not going to have time to play Expressive Iteration, but your combo opponent also necessarily isn't just comboing as soon as possible. Sure, you could probably argue that you can't really assume that, and you need to try to win as soon as possible, and that's kind of a good way to think about it, especially in terms of, like, mulliganing with this deck. I just personally, for me, am too scared to not just have all 4 Expressive Iterations, and then if you're in those matchups where you're not going to have time necessarily to cast Expressive Iteration, you can just get these out of your deck and bring in other forms of interaction, and just kind of, like, leave in some amount of, like, Preordain to, again, just make sure that you're able to push through the damage that you need to push through, and not wasting time, casting a cantrip that potentially could tap you out or leave you with 1 mana, especially in the main board games where you're not going to really have any interaction to deal with your opponent's, like, combat. We're not playing any spell pierces or anything like that in the main. We are all gas, no breaks here. So while this card can simultaneously be your worst card, it can also be your best card, making, like, the floor on this card pretty low, I would say on average, but even then, which is funny to say again in 2025 about Expressive Iteration, but the ceiling on this also is just absolutely amazing when you can use it as a catch-up tool or a way to just kind of distance yourself from your opponent. So really, probably with how this configuration looks here is probably where I'm going to start in my testing. I wouldn't be surprised if maybe cutting an iteration and even, like, going 4 Mutagenic, 2 Violent Urge ends up being correct, but I do like kind of the utility that Violent Urge itself kind of lends to you, even when you're not doing, like, Mutagenic plus this. If you end up casting 1 or 2 spells and then giving your creature double strike, that's still a lot of damage that this 1 mana spell does versus, just having additional Mutagenic Growth. And then, honestly, I don't even know if, like, the extra piece of, like, interaction in terms of, like, Unholy Heat, or maybe even fighting another burn spell, or playing another one of these, just doesn't really matter. I think that this is more bad. Like, if you cut this and play the another Mutagenic Growth, you're being actively worse against the midrange deck, because you're cutting a card that you want and playing a card that really is going to come out more than likely in your sideboard games. So I would just rather have that utility of, like, if I run into a midrange deck, 4 Iteration, 4 Cori-Steel, and, my cantrips and Dragon Rage Channelers are going to be the things that kind of power me to that portion of the game. The sideboard, I've tooled with 3 consigned to memory. I've had success with 3 consigned to memory. Again, it's probably one of those things where when I start my testing process, I'm going to just play 4 consigned to memory in the sideboard, and, probably based on how much Eldrazi that I see and how much I expect to get leading up to the event, it's probably going to be where I go from 3 to 4 consigned to memory. I don't think you go any less than 3 consigned to memories. I think this is just, unfortunately, a necessary evil, and while it's not fun to see every single sideboard playing, 4 consigned to memory or 3 consigned to memory, the only reason why I would even consider playing 3 is to have access to, like, a second into the Flood Maw, or potentially even a second Spell Snare, but I really think 1 Spell Snare is probably alright. Unholy Heat, on the other hand, is a card that I'm absolutely not cutting from the sideboard. I've seen some play 3. I've seen, 1 in the main board and then 3 in the sideboard. I think 4 in the sideboard's fine. I think that your at least main board configuration should just be, I'm going to win the game as fast as possible, because while your opponent is more than likely, if they're on a mid-range deck, they're just going to keep a hand that, probably has, like, 1 or 2 pieces of interaction, and then has, engine pieces. Very unlucky if you end up running into them and they just have, like, a ton of creature interaction and, like, no velocity from themselves, because then you kind of get up this top deck war. Their top deck on average is going to be better, even though you are drawing 2 Cori-Steel Cutters and Expressive Iterations and whatever. They're just, like, average, like, creature, and their average draw is just going to be a lot better than yours, because that's what they're built for. They're made different. As far as like Graveyard Hate, I do like 3 pieces of Graveyard Hate. Surgical might be, this might be correct here, is like 2 Surgical, 1 Soul Guide. I had been playing 2 Soul Guide, 1 Surgical. I've been happy with 1 Soul Guide. I've even messed around with like a Ghost Vacuum as like an option against, specifically Boros Energy. Might even be better against like the Esper decks, because they're also doing like, of course, they're doing the Gorios thing. They're also doing the, Gorios thing, they're doing the Emperor Bones thing, so this is like a way that you can kind of take away their cards and, make them feel super bad, and eventually have a way to kind of bring them back and put those threats on your battlefield and force them to deal with it. That said, Soul Guide, Surgical Extraction are more than likely just going to be the cards that I would roll with here in the sideboard in terms of Graveyard Hate. I think Spell Snare, as long as decks like Boros Energy and Esper continue to be really powerful, Spell Snare is just going to be a nice option in the sideboard. Into the Floodmaw is kind of like a catch-all interaction for any annoying permanents. We see things like, not this timing big enough, High Noon coming out of Boros at times. We've also seen like Damping Sphere, and we see it a lot in Standard, or at least we used to see in the Standard with the Izzet decks, where they would put like a lock piece in play and then pass the turn, and you would just bounce it on your turn, and then all of a sudden now I can cast all of my spells, and I don't care that you're replaying it, I don't care that I gave you a fish, whatever, because I just got a bunch of counters on my VV, and I got to get in for a ton of damage on top of forwarding my board plan, and you're going to have to spend 2 mana on your turn to redeploy your thing, where I could just as easily just bounce it again and do the same thing and probably win the game from there, if I hadn't already won the game from that. And that's a lot of the times what you can do here with Into the Floodmaw. It's like a nice safety valve where you can just bounce an annoying sideboarded permanent, and really just make it hard for your opponent. Because again, if they're spending 2 mana to put like a Damping Sphere into play, and you're like, okay, bounce it back to your hand, now they're tapped out, and you're just going to have free reign to cast, 2, 3, 4, 5 spells and, hit your opponent to extremely low or kill them. Or just forward your board so much where it's like you can't afford to play your hate piece again. You have to do something about my board. And chances are, like, it's not even going to be close to enough where maybe they can deal with, like, some of the creatures, but they can't deal with Cori-Steel, or they can deal with Cori-Steel, but they can't deal with the creatures. Obviously there's some tools that they're implementing now to kind of fight against that, but by and large, like, Into the Floodmaw is just kind of like a nice little safety valve in the sideboard there, and I wouldn't mind having a second one. Like, if I was gonna play 3 Consigned to Memories, I'd probably play an additional, like, Into the Floodmaw to start, and, like, maybe that ends up turning into, like, playing a Spell Snare, or even keeping 4 Consigned and playing 2 Spell Snare, and just saying whatever to the End of the Floodmaw, and trying to be a little bit more reactive with counter spells rather than being reactive with the bounce spells and stuff. And that's kind of where I would have my configuration. Speaking of sideboarding, I think sideboarding in this deck ends up being pretty simple. Just for the fact that, again, we were playing a ton of 4-ofs in our deck, and some cards, kind of like as we pointed out, and you probably got the vibe from, just don't end up being good in a lot of matchups. Something I really like doing in the matchups where our opponents are trying to be interactive, they're playing Fatal Pushes, they're playing, like Galvanic Discharges, Lightning Bolts, Prismatic Endings, Solitudes, whatever. I don't like having Mutagenic Growth and Violent Urge in my deck. Again, the blowout potential here is super high. Even in some of these cases too, I like kind of cutting like 1 or 2 Lava Darts here. This is like something that I'll kind of do against Boros Energy, where I've seen people cut like Slickshot Show Off. I don't even know if you necessarily need to cut Slickshot Show Off. I think part of this is kind of necessary because, like, your opponent is going to bring in more removal, and they're going to be focusing on trying to get rid of, like, Cori-Steel and, like, Dragon Rage Channeler, or maybe even Swiftspear, where Slickshot Show Off a lot of the time, like, you're going to be able to play it, and if they tap out, like, you're not punished, because there's not, unless they start doing something weird, they're not playing Solitude or anything like that, so you're just able to kind of, like, play a Slickshot Show Off, just hard cast it, not even plot it, or just leave it plotted and have it kind of sit and wait until your opponent decides to tap out, and then you can go. So I don't think necessarily cutting Slickshot Show Off is right. I like cutting the darts because a lot of the time they're going to bring in sideboard hate that stops you from multi-spelling, and Lava Dart is just way better when, it's, I played 2 spells, I dealt 2 damage to something, so either killing a creature, Best case, like 2 creatures, or just going 2 to the face, casting 2 spells, and making my creatures absolutely massive. There are 1 toughness creatures, notably like Ocelot Pride that you do, and Ragavan that you want to hit with Lava Dart, but, you know, I think it's just better to, like, not have these cards in your deck, play, like, 2 of them, and then get rid of, like, this interactive stuff here, or rather these, like, pump spells and whatever, and look to your sideboard and play things like Unholy Heat and bringing in, like, your Graveyard Hate, because Flage is absolutely beating, and, like, you're into the Floodmaw or Spell Snare or whatever. Like, there's probably more cards you can cut. Like, if you want to bring in into the Floodmaw and Spell Snare, you probably then could cut a, like, I've seen people cut Preordain. I don't know if I necessarily feel great about that, but that's also, like, and like, Iteration is, like, simultaneously good and bad, so you could probably cut, like, an Iteration or, like, a Preordain in that scenario, like, one of these 2 cards, and you can bring in that or whatever the interaction that you deem to fit the situation. I just think in general, like, you're almost assuredly cutting these 6 cards, probably really like these 8, and kind of moving on from there. Same thing with the Esper decks. I don't like these cards here. Like, really, unless you're playing against something like Neoform, playing against like Amulet Titan and those style of decks here, like, you're almost always keeping in the Violent Urges and Mutagenic Growths. If you're playing against, like, those combo matchups. If you're playing against Interaction, you're almost assuredly cutting these and probably some amount of these and bringing in some of these other more interactive cards. If you're playing against, like, combo, I really like cutting the Expressive Iterations. I don't really like these. And then you end up bringing in, like, Consign to Memory a lot of the time. You can choose to bring in, like, Into the Floodmaw, like, you bring in, like, Spell Pierces and stuff like that. And I think when you kind of become more reactive to that, I mean, you want to keep in Slickshot because of, like, the combo and stuff. And you're really, like, all of your creatures, so, like, you're probably still just cutting, like, Lava Darts and things like that. And that's probably what you're looking at in terms of sideboarding. I'm not going to say sideboarding is, like, simple, because it definitely is a skill. And even in this deck, where I think it's mostly clear cut, I mean, you can change them based on your feelings. Like, I definitely do it. Like, when I'm sideboarding, like, I just kind of get the vibe that, like, this would be right, or, you know, this would at least feel good for me, and, you know, at least I'm kind of right. Like, I'm glad that I had a sort of thing and potentially oversideboarded a hair, just to feel a little bit more confident in, like, the deck that I'm kind of bringing to the table at this point. But, you know, in general, that's kind of what we're looking at. If you are going to expect interaction and more interaction, especially to come in, you're just cutting, like, these pump spells and stuff. You're letting your creatures kind of do their thing while you're casting, like, cantrips and whatever. And if you just don't have the time to cast, like, your cantrips and stuff, you're cutting Iterations, probably some number of darts, possibly even, like, Preordains, even though I don't technically, like, to me that just doesn't feel good. But I mean, I've seen Preordains get cut in, like, the Boros Henry matchup, where, again, I think just having a 1-mana cantrip in a lot of scenarios ends up being pretty good. But, you know, again, I kind of see it cut from some really good players, so maybe that ends up being correct. Just to me, it doesn't feel good. As far as, like, tips and tricks to playing this deck and kind of getting the most that you can, as I just kind of shuffle these guys around and do these sort of things. Let's kind of clean this up a little bit. But really, like, some of the things that we want to kind of focus on when playing this deck. Cori-Steel Cutter is a hell of a Magic card. It is, just like Dragon Rage Channeler, a card that can be aggressive and can also be a very, very useful tool in the mid-range matchups. Holding your Mishra's Baubles, I'm not going to say is correct 100% of the time. You should absolutely do this every single time. You should not play a Bauble on turn 1. There's some scenarios where I absolutely will slam a Bauble on turn 1. Usually if I have, like, a Dragon Rage Channeler and, like, 2 Mishra's Baubles in hand, I'm willing to, like, spend one of those Baubles on Dragon Rage Channeler. You're not going to be able to attack on the first turn with Dragon Rage Channeler unless you have, like, playing Channeler and then, like, equip Cori-Steel and whatever. Then you're able to attack with on the first turn. But by and large, you're and, like, really, that's only happening in, like, the late of the late games, where it's like you're top decking, you have, like, a Cori-Steel Cutter or 2 left on the battlefield. Guess what? Dragon Rage Channeler is getting in for 4 trample in the air, and your opponent's not really going to be able to chump block it or whatever. if they even have flyers to actually be able to stop it from being able to get in. But I don't think that you're so heavily reliant on Dragon Rage Channeler and a bauble. Maybe you want to lean more towards that with decks being more interactive, just so you get some kind of value from Dragon Rage Channeler. But in reality, like, you don't need to get value right away with a Dragon Rage Channeler. I personally prefer if my opponent ends up like in this scenario, they kill my Dragon Rage Channeler turn 1, I go into my turn 2, and I'm able to go Cori-Steel Bauble. If my opponent ends up being like Esper and they have like Force plus blue card into like Fatal Push or Prismatic Ending, whatever, you know, it's kind of a blowout. You do get set back pretty far, but they ended up spending a ton of resources to kind of deal with those two things, and they still have to be able to deal with, you know, either future Dragon Rage Channelers or even Slickshot or Swiftspear at that point. Ends up being a little bit harder to deal with. So they have to have kind of like the perfect, like, you know, turn 1 turn cycle going into turn 2, where they interact with you on your turn 2 with like Force and Negation, but then also are able to play like Psychic Frog. But even then, Psychic Frog doesn't really get that big because you've used so many cards to kind of just deal with the first few threats of the game. So for me personally, I don't think that there's a lot of, like, you need to play Dragon Rage Channeler Bauble like you had to in the 2020s or whatever, when MH2 came out, and like that was kind of the thing to do. I don't think it's that important. I think getting more value out of Mishra's Bauble, whether it's Slickshot triggers, the Surveil from Dragon Rage Channeler to eventually get to Delirium, getting a token with Cori-Steel Cutter, even like the Prowess trigger on Swiftspear, is just more valuable to me than just getting a single Surveil trigger. And even if I miss out on the Surveil, I'm kind of fine with it, because you do have plenty of other ways where you are able to get Delirium to make future Dragon Rage Channelers, and of course your Violent Urge is even better. I just like the ability to make sure that Mishra's Bauble is also going to be able to get in damage outside, on top of potentially getting Surveil as well. It kind of forces your opponent to make that decision of playing a removal spell in turn 1 versus like potentially just committing to their own board. Again, Esper is just kind of like the outlier in this, because they do play 2 of the best free interaction spells in the format, on top of also getting to play cards like Thoughtseize or like other like 1-mana discard spells and other 1-mana interactive spells as well. But by and large, like something like Boros Energy, they have to say, okay, am I discharging this Channeler, or am I playing like Ocelot Pride on turn 1, or Guide of Souls, whatever. Like, there's a real decision that has to be made there. And it's especially brutal because, again, if they just choose to like add to their board, there's a potential that you're just playing out a bauble and you're playing a removal spell on their thing. You're triggering Delirium, very likely to trigger Delirium, I would say, from that point. That then you're just hitting your opponent for 3, and future Dragon Rage Channelers are forever going to be online, and, you know, you're just not necessarily... you're still worried about getting and maximizing the amount of damage, but you've kind of already blown your opponent out in that sense, where you got rid of like one of their best 1-mana plays. You essentially nullified their turn 1, got in damage, and started smoothing out your draws and stuff for future turns to just kind of ratchet up the pressure on your opponent. So personally, for me, that's like the biggest one. Don't feel like you have to play Bauble right away. Like, as soon as you can get value from Bauble, whether it's playing a Swiftspear on turn 1, like, unless you're sitting on like multiple Baubles, you know, like if you end up keeping in hands like 2 or 3 Baubles, like, sure, if you play Dragon Rage Channeler, go ahead and play a Bauble out. If you play Swiftspear on turn 1, go ahead and run a Bauble, unless your game plan is going to revolve around like Mutagenic plus Violent Urge, to where, again, Bauble is just going to want to kind of be held, so then you can just get another, +1 or really +2 damage because of the double strike to really get in damage and effectively kind of get yourself across the finish line here. Other things kind of involve really just sequencing, like Expressive Iteration being one of the big ones, where you want to, I'm going to bring this down a little bit, Expressive Iteration in particular being one where you just don't want to like play your land. Like, you get to your turn 3 and you immediately go and play your land. You're not playing Cloudstone or Cloudspire Captain. You want to, oh my goodness, I'm just losing my mind here. You want to Expressive Iteration, you want to leave yourself as many possibilities of playing spells off of this. Like, Expressive Iteration is great when it's effectively a draw 2. You want to, avoid playing your land unless you're playing around like a Censor or like a not Spell Snare, like a Spike type effect, or like a Mana Tithe or Oh my goodness, why can't I think of the name of the blue spell? Anyway, you know, even then, I don't think that's necessarily something, like, people are probably going to spell pierce you or force a negation anyway, and in one case, you have to pay 2 mana, you're not going to be able to do that in turn 3, and the other case, like, you're just not going to have a way of interacting with it in the main board games. So, like, really just playing Iteration on turn 2 before you play your land, really before you do anything else, because you're going to maximize the amount of chances that you have of hitting a land if you don't already have one, or finding a 0 or 1 mana spell that you're going to be able to put into exile and play because you already have the land. It's going to do so much digging for you. On top of course, having other Dragon Rage channelers out, having Slickshot, Swiftspear, Cori-Steel Cutter, I mean, probably even especially Cori-Steel Cutter and Dragon Rage channeler, where you're going to maximize your chances of double spelling, you know, putting a sorcery in the graveyard, working towards Delirium, like, which sorcery being probably one of your hardest, that and maybe creatures being one of the hardest ones to kind of get into your graveyard, and you're going to be able to have that knocked out. There's just so much stuff that Expressive Iteration does. Of course, again, it does feel bad in the matchups where you just don't have time to play it. But that said, it's still a very good card that is kind of a necessary evil when you kind of take everything into account here. Bolts, darts, you don't have to, like, end step lightning bolt your opponent or lava dart your opponent or whatever, really, unless obviously there's something like high noon or whatever, where you just want to, like, you know, you're playing one spell a turn, your, like, average spell versus, like, your opponent that's probably playing high noon is worse than them. You probably just want to fire off lightning bolts either at their face or to stop their creatures from, like, snowballing. A lot of time probably at the face, because you're able to, like, also play, like, another spell and continue to get in more damage and try to race them in some capacity. But you, in typical fashion, you don't have to cast lightning bolt on your opponent, like, immediately. You don't have to end step bolt. You really want to play your spells kind of at sorcery speed, or really on your turn. I shouldn't say sorcery speed, but on your turn, you want to be playing these spells because you want to put as much power into play and use that to pressure your opponent. You don't necessarily want to, kind of as we said before, you don't want to necessarily trigger Cori-Steel Cutter every single turn on your turn and your opponent's turn if it means that when you get to your turn and you have an opening for an attack, you're taking away, you know, X amount of damage from yourself because you want to make another token, and to you that just made more sense to make another token rather than hold on, wait, and, you know, get in for an additional 8 to 10 damage on your turn potentially. Again, I won't say that's necessarily wrong to that sort of thing, but I would say more often than not, you're going to you're going to be trying to figure out, like, okay, is it advantageous for me to double spell on my opponent's turn, or is it more advantageous for me to leave these 2 spells plus whatever else for my turn, and while I miss out on, like, 1 or 2 tokens potentially, depending on how many Cori-Steel Cutters, the damage that I'm going to then end up netting in a lot of those cases, whether my opponent's going to have to, like, start chum blocking or anything like that, is going to be beneficial to you. So definitely getting that sequencing down, not playing your third land right away if you have it in hand, and really just setting up, like, expressive iterations on turn 3, whether it's you plot show off and then play it into iteration, or playing Cori-Steel Cutter onto hopefully playing a bauble, and then iteration, hoping to maybe put a Cori-Steel Cutter in your hand, and then finding another spell to play to trigger the Cori-Steel Cutter, or finding a land so you can play a spell in your hand to trigger the Cori-Steel Cutter. It's kind of where a lot of these games devolve into. The mana base is probably the last thing that I'll really touch on here. Thundering Falls is just a card that ends up staying glued to your hand. That's just the rules. Like, if you play Surveil lands, they end up staying glued to your hand, especially if you're an 18-land deck. One thing I didn't mention, like the deck building, there's some people that play 17, some that play 19. I think 18 is, like, the sweet spot. All right, I've played a lot of matches with the 17-land version, and there were so many times that even after playing, like, Dragon Rage Channeler and surveilling with Mishra's Bauble, and drawing with Bauble, and then surveilling and casting a Preordain, whatever, like, and a lot of the best case scenarios, and this is going to be results-based thinking, I know, but seeing so many cards and then just still missing a second land drop, and really this deck missing its second land drop feels brutal when you're trying to either race the combo decks or you're trying to keep up with the mid-range decks. You really want to get to, like, 3, maybe 4 lands with this deck. And I think 4 is, like, extreme, because at least at that point you're casting a bunch of 1-mana spells, but you're only able to do that on 1, maybe 2 turns. So, like, it's not even really, like, that I would say that important. You really want to hit 3 lands. I think 18 is perfect. Again, playing like the 3rd mountain instead of the 2nd islet, I think is more correct, and just kind of like staying relatively high on the fetch lands to kind of thin your deck and make it, a lot more likely that you're going to be able to fetch up Thundering Falls if it doesn't magically end up appearing in your starting hand and you're forced to keep it. Or, again, like the deck thinning that you get, whether how marginal it ends up being, just ends up, at the end of the day, mattering whether the percentage is extremely small or ends up being extremely big here. Let's just kind of move these down here, because why the heck not? But really, that's kind of like the meat potatoes in the nutshell of this Izzet Prowess deck. I mean, it's a deck, again, that I've had a plenty of success with playing here. I'm going to sort these by mana value, sure. It's a deck that I've had a lot of success with. Again, we've played in a Modern Showcase. Like, we had the chance to be 6-3 and just completely punted it away. Like, literally, I think my brain was fried at that point. Plus, my garage is, like, insanely hot. It's, like, just sweltering, as the old people in the South would say. And it's just like sweltering here in Ohio, and my garage lacks plenty of airflow here. So, maybe a little bit of fatigue, maybe a little bit of like heat stress, whatever. Ended up misplaying, but ended up like still having a winning record in the showcase, where there's a lot of really, really good players, and I'm going to say like pretty exclusive. Like, you have to essentially kind of grind out or get very lucky to do very well in like challenges and leagues to be able to qualify for those sort of things. Playing in one of the Modern challenges, we ended up getting a top 8 with it. Made the elimination rounds of both RCQs that we played over the Modern RCQ season. Multiple 5-0s and a bunch of 4-1s on top of it. Like, this deck is just a bona fide winner, regardless of the metagame that you're playing in. I don't know. I mean, Modern can obviously get more interactive, but I think it's already kind of reaching the peak of how players are able to efficiently and effectively interact with the format, and this deck is still just performing very well. So don't be afraid to pick it up if, the amount of like solitudes and like fatal pushes or like ephemerate shenanigans or whatever are kind of scaring you from playing this deck. Don't let that scare you. Definitely just kind of, play to those sorts of matchups. Like in like kind of those mid-range strategies, you just need to find like one window. Like your opponent leaves the door open, or like even leaves it cracked. You're busting in like the Kool-Aid Man to get in a ton of damage and really just kind of put them on the back foot, because now their life total is kind of pressured by their mana base. They want to maximize the amount of dual lands that they have, things like that. So definitely don't be put off by the amount of interaction in the format. This deck is facing a ton of interaction currently from some of the top decks in the format, still performing very well. So don't be afraid. And if you have any questions or comments or any discussion things that you want to talk about in the comments down below, please feel free to leave those comments down there. I would love to talk about it. Of course, if you want to pop in the Discord, do the same thing. Totally fine. I accept all of the like comments, maybe even if you've played this deck before and you have like some of your own insights that you want to share, please feel free to do so in the comments down below. And with that said, that's going to be the end of the video. Hope you all enjoyed it. If you did, please leave a like on the video, and of course comment down below like your personal experiences playing Prowess, maybe what you think of the deck or whatever else. I'm always up for discussions in the comment section, and of course subscribe and leave a like on the video, all that fun stuff. But yeah, that's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it. I'll see you all in the next one.